The pale November sun struggled to break through the clouds over Horse Guards Parade as preparations for the Remembrance Sunday ceremony continued with quiet efficiency. The distant sound of rehearsing military bands carried on the wind, punctuated by the occasional crisp order from parade commanders. Veterans in dark coats with medals catching what little light there was gathered in small groups, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Red poppies adorned nearly every lapel, a somber reminder of sacrifice that seemed to make even the tourists speak in hushed tones. Occasional raindrops glistened on the polished buttons of ceremonial uniforms, the guards standing perfectly still despite the weather's challenges. Among the gathering crowd, a man with a purposeful stride and an expensive wool coat stood out, his American accent cutting through the respectful quiet as he gestured animatedly. "Make sure you get the guard in the background, Thomas," Dr. Ethan Powell instructed the camera operator he'd hired locally. "I want viewers to see the juxtaposition between real veterans and these ceremonial figures." He adjusted his glasses and checked his reflection in his phone camera, making sure his carefully cultivated academic appearance was perfect. "Ethan, I'm not sure we have proper clearance to film here," his producer, Rachel, said, looking up from her tablet with concern. "This is an active military ceremony preparation, not just a tourist attraction." "That's exactly my point," Dr. Powell replied with the confidence of someone used to academic authority. "Everyone treats these guards like tourist attractions when they're supposedly military personnel. That's precisely what my podcast exposes: the myths we're sold about military history." This episode of Military Myths Debunked will be our most controversial yet, Ethan announced, checking the latest download numbers on his phone. 3 million listeners can't be wrong. People are hungry for the truth behind these military theatrics. Rachel nodded professionally, though her eyes betrayed concern. "Just remember, we're guests here, Ethan. Your revisionist approach works well in lecture halls, but we're surrounded by veterans and active service members." "That's precisely why we're here," Ethan replied with the confidence that had made him popular in academic circles and increasingly on social media. "Someone needs to question why modern military budgets maintain these ceremonial units when defense technology should be the priority." Dr. Ethan Powell had built his reputation challenging what he called sanitized military history. His Boston University position gave him academic credibility, while his podcast provided the platform. With 3 published books on military mythology, he'd cultivated a following among those who enjoyed seeing established institutions questioned. "My research shows these ceremonial units are relics that drain resources from actual defense capabilities," he continued, rehearsing points for his recording. "The public deserves to know how much these human tourist attractions cost taxpayers." Thomas adjusted a lens, his movements becoming slightly more rigid as Ethan's voice carried to nearby veterans. Rachel noticed and stepped closer to Ethan. "Maybe we should focus on historical aspects rather than criticizing active units during a remembrance event," she suggested quietly. "Rachel, my entire career is built on challenging the narratives we're fed," Ethan replied dismissively. "These ceremonial guards perpetuate myths about military tradition that obscure budget realities. That's the story I'm here to tell." He straightened his posture and adopted his podcast voice, positioning himself strategically with the guards visible in the background, ignoring the increasingly uncomfortable glances from visitors and veterans nearby. "In today's military landscape," he rehearsed loudly, "maintaining ceremonial units represents a significant misallocation of defense resources. My analysis suggests these units cost British taxpayers millions annually, money that should fund actual combat capabilities." Thomas focused the camera reluctantly as Ethan continued, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "While modern warfare demands technological advancement and specialized training, countries like Britain continue financing what amounts to elaborate military theater. These guards, impressive as they look, represent outdated military priorities." An elderly man wearing a veteran's beret with campaign medals approached, walking with a slight limp but carrying himself with dignity. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "I couldn't help overhearing. Those guards you're referring to are actually part of fully operational regiments that rotate between ceremonial and combat duties. Many have served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq." Ethan smiled with practiced academic patience. "I appreciate your perspective, But my research into defense budgets tells a different story. I have published 3 peer-reviewed papers on military resource allocation. He turned to Rachel. Make sure we're getting this exchange. It illustrates exactly how these myths perpetuate. The veteran's expression hardened. It's not a perspective, sir. It's a fact. I served alongside men from the Household Division in Helmand Province. With respect, Ethan replied, not sounding particularly respectful. Anecdotal evidence doesn't negate systemic analysis. My forthcoming book demonstrates how ceremonial units receive disproportionate funding compared to their operational utility. Rachel stepped forward, sensing tension. We should probably check about filming permissions before continuing, she suggested, glancing apologetically at the veteran. We're in a public space documenting a public ceremony. Ethan dismissed her concern. My podcast exposes how military tradition is used to justify questionable budget priorities. The British government allocates millions to maintain these ceremonial units while cutting actual defense capabilities. The veteran shook his head and walked away as Ethan continued positioning himself for the perfect shot, oblivious to the growing discomfort of those around him. Thomas, make sure you capture the contrast between those expensive uniforms and the actual veterans here today, Ethan instructed. That visual juxtaposition perfectly illustrates my thesis about misplaced military priorities. The numbers don't lie. Ethan projected his voice as a small crowd of tourists gathered, attracted by his confident tone. Each ceremonial guard uniform costs thousands. Bearskin hats alone require maintenance budgets that could fund tactical equipment for actual combat soldiers. He moved closer to the restricted area where a guard stood at his post, Thomas reluctantly following with the camera. What my research reveals, Ethan continued, gesturing toward the guard, is that maintaining these ceremonial units diverts approximately 0.8% of Britain's defense budget money that should go toward cyber warfare capabilities or drone technology. A military chaplain in uniform approached, his collar identifying his role. Sir, I believe you're operating under some misconceptions. These guards are fully operational soldiers who— I'm familiar with the official narrative, Ethan interrupted. My doctorate focused on military budget analysis. When you examine the numbers objectively, ceremonial units show poor return on investment compared to specialized combat forces. The chaplain tried again. I've served as chaplain to the Household Division. These men rotate from ceremonial duties to combat deployments regularly. Many standing guard today have combat experience in. With respect, chaplain, Ethan cut him off. Military institutions naturally defend their traditions. My analysis compares defense budgets across NATO countries. Those allocating fewer resources to ceremonial units show higher operational readiness metrics. Rachel approached urgently. Ethan, we definitely need official permission to film this close to the guard. Security has noticed us. This is exactly what I'm documenting, Ethan replied, loud enough for bystanders to hear. The resources spent protecting ceremonial figures rather than focusing on actual security threats. Look at the manpower dedicated to guarding a ceremonial post compared to critical infrastructure. Thomas lowered his camera slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the developing situation. The crowd had grown, with some tourists filming on phones while veterans watched with increasingly stern expressions. In America, Ethan continued, approaching the boundary rope, we've streamlined military expenditure to focus on combat effectiveness rather than ceremonial tradition. My research shows British forces maintain these units at the expense of battlefield capabilities. The guard remained motionless, though observers familiar with the guards might have noticed the subtle tightening of his grip on his rifle. The chaplain had stepped away, speaking quietly to another uniformed officer who listened with growing concern. Consider the cost-benefit ratio, Ethan continued, his academic confidence unwavering. Each guard here represents training hours, equipment, and salary that could be allocated to genuine defense priorities rather than maintaining what amounts to a living museum exhibit. Emboldened by the attention, Ethan stepped over the clearly marked line, ignoring the warning signs as he moved closer to the guard post. Thomas hesitated but continued filming, though his discomfort was evident in his rigid posture. My latest budget analysis, Ethan announced, now addressing both his imagined podcast audience and the gathering crowd, indicates the household division consumes approximately £42 million annually, resources that modern military strategy would better allocate to technological advancement. The crowd murmured as Ethan crossed into the restricted area, several visitors pointing to the boundary signs he'd ignored. A Japanese tour group whispered among themselves, their guide frowning deeply at the display of disrespect. Two British schoolchildren tugged at their teacher's sleeve, eyes wide with concern as they watched the American professor breach the clearly marked boundary. The atmosphere shifted noticeably, a ripple of tension spreading through the gathered onlookers. These ceremonial guards, he continued, gesturing dismissively, haven't seen actual combat deployment since 2010, according to my research. They've become military relics, impressive to tourists but irrelevant to modern warfare. He stood inappropriately close to the guard position now, speaking with the confident authority of someone accustomed to lecture halls. My recommendation to defense ministries worldwide is clear: phase out ceremonial units and reallocate those resources to combat effective forces. Replace these human guards with security technology and save taxpayers millions while improving actual defense capabilities. The chaplain had returned with a senior officer, both watching with growing concern as Ethan continued. Consider the operational inefficiency, Ethan lectured, completely missing the shifting atmosphere. Each guard here represents approximately £80,000 of annual expenditure when accounting for training, equipment, housing, and ceremonial duties, a luxury modern defense budgets cannot justify. He turned directly toward the guard, whose expression remained impassive, though something had changed in his bearing, a subtle tension now evident to those with military experience. These men are essentially performing military theater tradition that may have historical significance but lacks operational relevance in contemporary defense strategy, Ethan declared. My podcast reveals how military budgets across NATO countries show direct correlation between ceremonial expenditure reduction and combat readiness improvement. The guard's rifle suddenly snapped to position with a sharp, precise movement that made Thomas step back and Ethan freeze mid-sentence. The ceremonial stillness had transformed into authoritative military presence in an instant. The guard's eyes now fixed directly on Ethan with unmistakable command presence. Sir, the guard's voice carried the steel forged in places far from ceremonial duties, you have crossed a restricted area and are making assertions that are factually incorrect. Step back behind the line immediately. The crowd fell silent, the sudden transformation from ceremonial figure to commanding military presence catching everyone by surprise. Thomas lowered his camera completely, no longer filming, as Ethan stood momentarily speechless, his academic confidence visibly shaken by the guard's authoritative intervention. I am Sergeant James Harwick, Grenadier Guards, the guard stated with precision that matched his immaculate uniform. I completed my third tour in Helmand Province 8 months ago before rotating back to ceremonial duties. Step behind the line, sir. Ethan retreated one step, but his academic instinct to debate reasserted itself. My research clearly shows. Your research is incorrect, Sergeant Harwick interrupted, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of combat command. The household division, including the Grenadier Guards, Welsh Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Coldstream Guards, maintains fully operational battalions that rotate between ceremonial duties and combat deployments. The chaplain stepped forward. I served as chaplain with the Welsh Guards in Afghanistan, Dr. Powell. The men you see on ceremonial duty today were likely in combat zones last year and will return to operational status after their rotation. Sergeant Harwick continued, not moving from his post but commanding complete attention. Since 2001, household division regiments have deployed continuously to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones. I personally served 3 combat tours, as have most of the guards currently on ceremonial duty. But the budget allocations Ethan attempted are also misrepresented in your assessment, the sergeant countered. Ceremonial duties constitute approximately 12% of our operational time, but generate significant tourism revenue that offsets those costs. The remaining 88% involves combat training, deployment, and operational readiness identical to other infantry regiments. A veteran from the crowd stepped forward. I served with Tupara and Helmand alongside the Grenadier Guards in 2009. They suffered casualties while taking Taliban positions that other units couldn't breach. Rachel, who had been researching on her tablet, approached Ethan. He's right. I am finding deployment records that contradict your research. The Guards regiments have maintained continuous combat deployments alongside their ceremonial duties. The bearskin caps and red tunics you referenced, Sergeant Harwick continued, are worn approximately 9% of our service time. The remainder is spent in standard combat uniforms with the same equipment as other infantry units. But the cost per soldier, Ethan tried again, is nearly identical to other elite infantry units when ceremonial equipment is excluded, the sergeant stated with the precision of someone who had lived this reality rather than merely studying it. Ceremonial uniform costs are largely offset by tourism revenue generated by the very traditions you're criticizing. The senior officer who had been standing with the chaplain stepped forward. Dr. Powell, I am Colonel Richards, Ministry of Defense. Your budget analysis failed to account for the operational deployment ratio of Guard regiments and incorrectly allocated standard infantry training costs as ceremonial expenses. Guard regiments cost approximately 7% more than standard infantry while maintaining higher operational readiness metrics and combat deployment rates. Ethan looked at his notes, then at Rachel's tablet showing contradictory information. His confident narrative visibly crumbling as Sergeant Harwick continued to stand at perfect attention, the living embodiment of both ceremonial precision and battle-hardened capability. The ceremonial tradition you've dismissed as theatrical, Sergeant Harwick continued, his voice carrying both military precision and historical knowledge, develops discipline that translates directly to combat effectiveness. The attention to detail required for ceremonial duties correlates with lower casualty rates in deployment. Colonel Richards nodded. Our analysis of performance metrics shows Guard regiments consistently rank among our highest performing units in both combat operations and readiness assessments. The ceremonial precision you witness here reflects the same discipline applied in combat zones. But surely the resources allocated to maintaining these traditions, Ethan began, his academic certainty wavering, are minimal compared to operational costs, the colonel interrupted. The ceremonial aspects of these regiments constitute less than 3% of their overall budget. The tourism revenue generated by ceremonial duties actually contributes approximately £15 million annually to defense funding. The chaplain produced a document from his pocket. These are the deployment statistics for Household Division regiments since 2001. They've maintained continuous presence in every major operation while simultaneously fulfilling ceremonial duties through rotation systems. Rachel had been fact-checking on her tablet. Ethan, she said quietly, their combat deployment rates are actually 8% higher than standard infantry regiments over the past decade. Sergeant Harwick remained at attention but continued speaking. The ceremonial uniform costs you cited include both historical misattribution and mathematical errors. Annual maintenance of ceremonial equipment averages £1,200 per soldier, not the £8,000 figure in your podcast. That can't be right, Ethan protested, though with less conviction. The bearskin caps last an average of 80 years with proper maintenance, the sergeant explained. The cost amortized annually is approximately £40 per soldier. Your figures appear to have calculated replacement costs as annual expenses. Colonel Richards added, Guard regiments maintain dual capability by design, not accident. The discipline visible in ceremonial duties directly enhances combat performance. The selection process for these regiments is actually more stringent than standard infantry. The veteran who had spoken earlier nodded. I saw them in action in Helmand. The same precision you see here translated to the most disciplined room-clearing operations I witnessed during my deployment. Ethan stared at the documentation in his hands, then at Rachel's tablet showing deployment records that contradicted his research. His confident academic posture had gradually given way to genuine confusion. I don't understand, he said, more to himself than anyone else. My analysis of defense budget allocations clearly showed disproportionate funding for ceremonial units. You were looking at aggregate numbers without operational context, Colonel Richards explained patiently. The budget lines don't distinguish between standard infantry expenses and ceremonial costs. The ceremonial aspects represent approximately 7% of total Guard regiment expenses. Ethan flipped through the chaplain's documents. These deployment records, they don't match what I found in my research. Because your research relied on public budget summaries rather than actual operational data, the colonel said. Understandable for an academic without military background, but it led to fundamental misinterpretations. Sergeant Harwick maintained his position but added, "The ceremonial precision you witnessed, sir, is the same discipline that keeps soldiers alive in combat. There is no separation between the standards required here and those required in operational theaters." "I never considered that perspective," Ethan admitted, his academic certainty giving way to genuine curiosity. "You're saying the ceremonial requirements actually enhance combat effectiveness rather than detract from it?" "Precisely," Colonel Richards confirmed. Performance metrics consistently show Guard regiments maintain higher operational readiness scores than units without ceremonial duties. The attention to detail visible here translates directly to weapons maintenance, tactical precision, and discipline under fire. Rachel approached, still checking facts on her tablet. "Ethan, we could pivot the podcast to explore this dual role, how ceremonial tradition actually enhances modern military effectiveness. That's a story we haven't told before." For the first time, Ethan looked at Sergeant Harwick with something approaching respect rather than academic dismissal. "Have you really completed 3 combat tours? Afghanistan in 2010, 2013, and 2022, sir," the sergeant replied. "Between those deployments, I returned to ceremonial duties and trained new guards in both ceremonial precision and combat tactics. My last tour included coordinating complex joint operations with U.S. Marines in Helmand Province and leading a specialized reconnaissance unit. 3 men in my section received commendations for actions that saved both British and American lives during an ambush situation. That same section is currently rotating through ceremonial duties, maintaining the same standards of excellence in both roles." "I never made the connection," Ethan acknowledged, genuine humility replacing his earlier confidence. "My research methodology focused exclusively on budget efficiency without considering operational effectiveness." The chaplain smiled slightly. "Perhaps your next podcast could explore how tradition and effectiveness reinforce rather than contradict each other." "I owe your men an apology," Ethan said to Colonel Richards. "I made assumptions based on incomplete data and presented them as conclusive findings." "Academic perspective is valuable," the colonel replied, "but military reality often contains nuances that don't appear in budget documents. If you're genuinely interested in understanding the modern role of Guard regiments, I can arrange for you to speak with our defense economists." "I would appreciate that opportunity," Ethan said with newfound sincerity. "It seems I have significant gaps in my understanding that need addressing before my next publication." Sergeant Harwick returned to his ceremonial stance, the transition back to tradition seeming more meaningful now that Ethan understood the depth behind the precision. Don't forget, like this video, subscribe to Guards Moments, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an incredible story. Stay tuned for more jaw-dropping real-life encounters, and check out our previous videos appearing on your screen now. We'll see you in the next one.